The cold winds of Christmas Eve howled across the plains as Jacob Miller stood alone at the edge of the small train station. The snow fell in thick, swirling clouds, burying the platform under a thick blanket of white. In his hand, he held a photograph, the one of Catherine he'd received weeks ago. Her soft smile had filled his thoughts for months. A man like him, isolated and alone, had sent out an ad for a wife, hoping for a better life. Catherine had responded, and now, after months of waiting, she was finally on her way. Jacob's breath puffed in front of him, his boots sinking into the deep snow as he paced, waiting. It had been 3 hours since the train was supposed to arrive, and there was no sign of it. The storm was fierce, snow and wind making the air bitterly cold. Jacob rubbed his hands together, a mixture of nervous anticipation and the harsh reality of his situation. He had never met Catherine in person. He only knew her from letters. The whole town had been buzzing about his choice. There were whispers of judgment from some, excitement from others. Jacob was determined to see it through, despite the nerves in his chest. Finally, the distant rumble of a train could be heard, cutting through the blizzard. As the train approached, Jacob stood tall, the cold biting at his face. The train screeched to a halt in front of him, and the heavy doors of the coach creaked open. Through the swirling snow, a lone figure stepped out, Catherine. But there was something different, something that froze Jacob's heart for a moment. She was holding a small bundle in her arms. A baby. The crowd of townspeople that had gathered around the station watched, their faces filled with curiosity and judgment. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He had come here expecting a wife, a woman to build a life with. But this was not what he had imagined. His mind raced. What was he supposed to do? The woman he had hoped would walk beside him, start a family with him, was holding a child that was not his. Catherine's eyes met his, wide with fear. She stepped forward, clutching the baby tighter. I can explain," she stammered, her voice trembling. Jacob stood still, staring at her, the questions flooding his mind. He could feel the eyes of the entire town on him, waiting for him to make a choice. His hand tightened around the strap of his bag, his anger welling up, but he kept it in check. "You didn't mention a child in your letters," he said quietly, the words coming out harder than he meant. Catherine lowered her head. "I know," she whispered. "I had nowhere else to go." The townspeople whispered among themselves, exchanging glances and murmurs. Jacob's mind spun with confusion, but the one thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't leave her here, alone, in the middle of a snowstorm. He had to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. Without saying another word, Jacob stepped forward, taking the heavy trunk from her hand. He loaded it onto the wagon, and the two of them began the silent journey to the ranch. The baby, wrapped tightly in blankets, whimpered from the cold, her little face pale in the wintry air. The snow was falling harder now, the wind howling as the wagon creaked along the narrow path. It was dangerous, the roads barely visible, but Jacob kept his focus on the trail ahead. Catherine sat beside him, her body tense, her eyes darting nervously to him every now and then. "Her name is Lena," Catherine said softly after a long silence. "She's 3 months old." Jacob didn't reply at first. The wind howled as he urged the horses forward. "You didn't mention her in your letters," he repeated, his voice distant. It wasn't an accusation, it was just a statement of fact. "I know," Catherine said, her voice filled with shame. "I didn't know how to tell you. I was afraid that you wouldn't want us." Jacob drove the wagon through the snow, the silence between them thick and uncomfortable. The town, the people, the judgment, they were all left behind now. It was just the two of them, alone in the cold. Catherine shivered beside him, and Jacob could feel the weight of the situation settle in his chest. He didn't know how to feel, confused, angry, even betrayed. But more than anything, he didn't know what was going to happen next. They arrived at the ranch as the snowstorm raged on, the wind biting at their skin as they unloaded the wagon. The house was small but warm, the light from the lanterns inside casting a soft glow against the storm. Jacob helped Catherine down from the wagon, then carried her trunk inside without a word. The baby, Lena, had begun to cry, her little lips turning blue from the cold. "Get inside," Jacob said, his voice softer than before. "Warm her up. We'll talk after." Inside, the cabin was modest but prepared. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the room was cozy, though small. Catherine sat down, carefully unwrapping Lena from her blankets and holding her close to the warmth of the fire. Jacob stood by the door, his mind still racing with questions. Catherine finally spoke, her voice shaky. "I had a husband. He was violent. He died in a bar fight. His family blamed me for everything, turned me out when I was pregnant. I had nowhere to go, nowhere but here." Jacob made coffee, his hands shaking as he poured the water. The weight of her words hit him, but his emotions were still tangled. "Why didn't you tell me about her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Catherine didn't look up as she fed Lena, her face pale and drawn. "I didn't know what else to do. I was too afraid to lose you, too afraid to be alone." Jacob stared into his cup, his mind spinning. He didn't know what to think, what to feel. He had wanted a wife, but this was something else. This was a family, his family now, whether he was ready or not. The silence stretched on between them as the fire crackled. Outside, the storm howled in the distance, but inside the small house, they were safe. For tonight, at least. "Storm's too bad tonight," Jacob said finally, his voice rough. "You'll stay. Tomorrow." He paused, looking into his cup. "Tomorrow we'll see." Catherine's heart raced as she wondered if she had one night or a lifetime. The storm outside howled, but inside, they were trapped together, alone with their choices, their fears, and the unknown future. The morning after the storm, Christmas Day, arrived with a crisp chill that hung in the air, the warmth from the fire in the small cabin offering the only comfort. Catherine woke early, the sound of the wind still howling outside, but the fire inside crackling with life. She had no idea what would happen now, what Jacob's decision would be after the night they'd spent together. She had told him everything she could, and still, the questions weighed on her like a heavy cloak. Would he turn her away once the storm cleared, or would he keep his promise of family? She lay there for a moment, listening to the creaking of the house, the rhythmic crackling of the fire, and the soft sounds of Lena stirring beside her. It was a rare stillness in her life, a moment where things didn't feel so chaotic, so full of fear and uncertainty. When she finally sat up, the room was already lit with the soft glow of early morning light filtering through the cabin's windows. Jacob was already up. He was by the fire, stoking the embers with practiced hands. The fire crackled, sending small pops through the room. He didn't look up when she entered, but the simple action of him having already started the day gave Catherine a strange sense of calm. He had not kicked him out. He had not said anything harsh or cruel. He was just here. As she moved toward the stove, Jacob turned, the silence between them like a thin thread that hadn't yet been broken. "I made coffee," he said softly, his voice still rough with sleep. Catherine nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she took the cup from him. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, still unsure of her place in this strange new life. The moment was awkward, tense, as though both of them were waiting for something to give, an apology, a declaration, anything that might change the silence hanging between them. But nothing came, and they sat together, quietly sipping their coffee, each of them lost in their thoughts. After breakfast, Jacob stood up. "We're going to church today," he said matter-of-factly, his voice as steady as always. Catherine looked at him in surprise. She had expected to spend the day in the house, still unsure of what was happening between them. But church? She hadn't expected that. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. Jacob nodded. "I made a commitment," he said, his gaze steady. A man's word should mean something. The thought of being seen publicly with him, with them was terrifying to Catherine. She had no idea how the town would react to her. Would they scorn her for showing up with a child who wasn't even Jacob's? But then again, what was she supposed to do? She had nowhere else to go, and this ranch was her only chance for something resembling a life. Jacob hadn't rejected them outright, and for now, that had to be enough. He had already promised to marry her, and though the circumstances were far from ideal, she felt a faint hope spark in her chest. Jacob led her out into the cold, and they made their way to the small frontier church. It was only a short walk, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on Catherine's shoulders. As they entered the church, every eye in the room turned to them. The women whispered, and some looked sympathetic, but most were judgmental, eyes narrowed as they observed the new arrivals. Catherine kept her head down, clutching Lena tightly in her arms as Jacob led her to a pew. Mrs. Halloway, an older woman known for her kindness, smiled at her and leaned over. "Your baby is beautiful," she said quietly, offering a soft, welcoming smile. "Welcome." She handed Catherine a small bundle of knitted baby clothes, a quiet gesture of kindness that Catherine didn't know how to respond to. It was the first kindness she'd received from anyone in this town. But just as quickly, the kindness was overshadowed by the sharp voice of Elder Finch, who stood in the back, glaring at Jacob. "People will talk," he muttered, his voice low but filled with judgment. "Questions will arise about that child of yours. People will wonder who she really belongs to." Jacob's jaw clenched, but he stepped forward, standing tall. "Careful what you say about my wife," he said firmly, his voice steady but filled with warning. Catherine could feel her heart beating faster. Had Jacob just called her his wife? Was he standing up for her? For the first time since the night they arrived, Catherine felt a spark of hope. Jacob's words were quiet, but they were enough. The rest of the service passed in a blur. Catherine could barely focus, the eyes of the congregation heavy on her. It wasn't until they were back in a wagon, heading home, that Jacob spoke again. "We'll make it through this," he said softly, his voice unreadable. Catherine didn't know if he meant they'd make it through the town's judgment or if he was talking about something deeper, something between them. But whatever it was, she clung to it. Over the next few days, the silence between them deepened. The routine of daily life began to take shape. Catherine cooked, cleaned, and cared for Lena. Jacob worked the land, the ranch barely surviving the harsh winter. They exchanged few words during the day, the awkwardness between them too thick to break. Yet there were moments, small moments, that seemed to bridge the distance. One afternoon, as she folded Jacob's shirt, Catherine reached for it at the same time as he did. Their hands brushed, and for a brief moment, she felt the heat of his touch, but neither of them said anything. Later, when Lena began to cry, Jacob froze when the baby reached for him. He had never held a child before, and the hesitation was clear in his movements. But then, slowly, he reached out and took Lena in his arms. Catherine watched, heart in her throat. He held her carefully, unsure at first, but as Lena quieted, he seemed to relax, a small smile tugging at his lips. For a moment, Catherine allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. But even in these moments, there was still a wall between them. That evening, as Catherine rocked Lena to sleep, she overheard Jacob talking to his horse in the barn. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "I don't know what to do. I wanted a wife, not a ready-made family." The words stung, and Catherine's heart clenched. He didn't want her. Not really. He wasn't ready for a child that wasn't his own. She had known that from the start, but hearing him admit it out loud made the truth harder to swallow. She wanted to believe that he could love Lena as his own, but she wasn't sure. Catherine sat by the fire that night, holding Lena close, and let the tears fall silently. She had made a mistake, thinking she could find a home in this place, with a man who wasn't ready to accept her or her child. But the next morning, everything changed. As they prepared to start the day, Lena's fever spiked. Her tiny body burned with heat, and Catherine's panic set in. She couldn't lose her, not after everything they had been through. Jacob didn't hesitate. He immediately saddled his horse and rode through the blizzard to find a doctor. The storm raged outside, the cold biting at their skin as Catherine held Lena in her arms, tears streaming down her face. When Jacob returned hours later, his face was grim. "The doctor's snowbound," he said. "We'll have to bring the fever down ourselves." The two of them worked through the night, trying to cool Lena's fever with wet cloths and blankets. Catherine was exhausted, crying as she rocked Lena back and forth. "I can't lose her," she whispered, her voice breaking. Jacob knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "She's not all you have," he said quietly. "You have me." Those simple words struck Catherine deep in her heart. It wasn't just Lena he was trying to save. It was her family. The night passed slowly, the hours stretching long into the morning. Finally, the fever broke, and Lena slept soundly in Catherine's arms. Exhausted, Catherine collapsed, and Jacob caught her before she fell. "I'm sorry I've been cold," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I was scared. I've been alone for so long. I wanted a family, but I didn't know how to have one." Catherine lifted her head, looking into his eyes for the first time in days. "We can be that," she whispered, "if you let us." Jacob's hand shook as he touched her cheek, his lips brushing hers in a soft, tentative kiss. "Preacher said he'd marry us proper on New Year's Eve," Jacob said quietly. "If you still want to." Catherine's heart swelled with emotion. She nodded, tears in her eyes. Yes. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time since she had arrived, she felt like she might belong. New Year's Eve arrived like a shadow, a mix of hope and trepidation swirling in the air. As Catherine prepared herself for the wedding she wasn't sure she deserved. Her fingers shook slightly as she buttoned up her simple wedding dress, a gown borrowed from Mrs. Halloway, who had graciously provided it with the promise that Catherine would wear it for the ceremony. The dress was plain, but Catherine didn't care. She was more focused on the quiet joy of finally becoming part of something real, something stable. The small ranch had become a home for her and Lena, and though it wasn't perfect, it was theirs. Jacob had promised her a future, and she was clinging to that promise with everything she had. The house was quiet except for the crackling of the fire and the sound of Lena's soft babbling in the next room, a comforting noise that brought warmth to Catherine's heart. Mrs. Halloway helped her with her hair, tying it up neatly and whispering words of encouragement. "You'll be a beautiful bride," she said with a soft smile, but Catherine could tell there was an edge of worry in the older woman's voice. "Just be prepared. There are people who don't approve. The town's divided about you." Catherine nodded, trying to brush aside the growing anxiety. She had come this far, and she couldn't back out now. Jacob had asked her to marry him, and though their life had begun with a storm, it had calmed into something she thought might be lasting. There was nothing left to do but move forward. But as she stood there, staring at her reflection, a part of her wondered if this would be enough, if they could ever truly belong in this community, in this life. She looked at herself in the worn mirror, the reflection of a woman on the verge of a new beginning, but also a woman who carried the weight of her past and her secrets. The church was small and simple, but it was where they had all gathered, a place of hope and faith for the few townspeople willing to attend. Jacob had insisted they go forward with the wedding, regardless of the whispers and the judgment that came from many quarters. They were getting married in front of God, and that was enough for him. Catherine had agreed, but she couldn't shake the fear that there would always be a part of her that would never be accepted. Jacob had been a pillar of strength and confidence throughout their time together, but Catherine could see the strain in his eyes. The past days had shown her that he wasn't just scared of losing them. He was scared of how others saw them. She wasn't sure if he realized it, but his heart had been just as closed off as hers. His silence was a wall, one that neither of them had been able to break. As the minutes ticked by, the soft murmur of guests gathering reached her ears, and she felt her nerves tighten. Mrs. Holloway gave her a final nod and left to join the other guests in the small church. Catherine stood there for a moment, alone in the room, her thoughts swirling. Jacob would be waiting for her at the altar, but she wasn't sure how much she could ask of him. She wasn't even sure if she was the woman he needed. The doors to the church swung open, and the cool winter air poured in. Catherine took a deep breath and walked toward the door, her heart thumping in her chest. As she stepped into the church, she saw Jacob standing by the altar, his back straight, his eyes only for her. The sight made her chest tighten, but it also gave her a small sense of hope. The congregation was sparse. Only a few people from the town had shown up, but Catherine could feel their eyes on her. Some were sympathetic, but many of them were not. She could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. As she walked toward Jacob, the whispering grew louder. She could hear the women's hushed voices, their words filled with disapproval, some even sneering at the child in her arms. Catherine's hands trembled as she reached the altar. Jacob smiled at her, his eyes warm but serious. "We're going to make it," he whispered as she joined him, but his voice lacked the confidence she had come to expect. She knew he was just as afraid as she was. Before the preacher could begin, the doors to the church burst open. A man entered, tall and imposing, with an air of arrogance that immediately unsettled Catherine. He wore a fine Eastern coat, clearly out of place in the frontier town, and his eyes scanned the room, landing on Catherine and Jacob. His presence seemed to halt the entire ceremony. The man walked toward the altar with a purposeful stride, and Jacob's expression shifted from one of nervous anticipation to surprise, then anger. "This wedding cannot proceed," the man said, his voice sharp and commanding. "I am Richard Brennan, and I have a claim on this child." The words sent shockwaves through the room, and Catherine felt her blood run cold. Richard stepped forward, pulling out legal documents from his coat. "These are the papers that make me Lena's legal guardian," he said, his voice dripping with smug authority. "My brother's child belongs with her blood relatives, not strangers." Catherine's eyes widened. "You threw me out. You and your family threw me out when I was pregnant. You didn't want me then. You said I shamed the family," she cried out, her voice rising with a mix of anger and hurt. Richard didn't flinch. "We've reconsidered. The child is a Brennan, and I have the right to take her back," he stated coldly, his eyes fixed on Jacob, daring him to object. The room was silent, the air thick with tension as everyone waited for Jacob's response. Jacob's jaw clenched, and his fists tightened at his sides. "Says who?" he asked, his voice low but filled with resolve. Richard smirked, flipping through the papers. "Says the law. I'm her blood uncle. Were you her mother's fiancé?" His words cut deep, but Jacob stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "You have no rights to this child. You abandoned them when they needed you most," Jacob said, his voice hardening. The entire congregation was watching now, some in disbelief, others with rapt attention. Richard's smirk never faded as he turned to the crowd. "The child's worth $30,000. She's the heir to my family's estate." The truth hit Catherine like a slap. Richard didn't care about Lena. He only cared about the money. Jacob's eyes flared with fury, but he held his ground. "You didn't want them when they had nothing. Why now?" he asked, his voice rising. Richard's expression twisted into a sneer. "Because now she's valuable," he said. "She's a Brennan, and I'll make sure she has what's rightfully hers." Catherine felt the world close in around her. She had known this man, Richard, had seen his cruelty before, but hearing him speak with such disregard for Lena, for her, made her blood boil. She stood up straighter, holding Lena close, determined not to let this man take her daughter. Jacob stepped forward, facing Richard. "If you want her, you'll have to go through me," he said, his voice firm. Richard laughed, dismissing him with a wave. "You're not even married yet," he mocked. "You have no claim on her. No rights. Nothing." Jacob turned to the preacher. "Can you marry us? Right now?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. The preacher hesitated for a moment before nodding. I can. Right here, right now. Jacob turned to Catherine, his gaze softening for the first time that day. Marry me. Marry me for real. If we're married, I can adopt Lena. She'll be mine, and we'll be a family. We'll fight for her together. Catherine's heart leapt in her chest, and for the first time, she saw the sincerity in Jacob's eyes. Yes, she whispered. Yes. The preacher quickly rushed through the vows, the ceremony short but filled with meaning. As the words, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," were spoken, Jacob kissed Catherine deeply, a kiss that sealed their fate. The crowd stood in stunned silence, but Jacob didn't care. He had done what was necessary to protect his family. Lena was his legally and in his heart. But as they celebrated, Richard stormed out, promising he would return with lawyers. "This isn't over," he yelled as he left, but the sheriff quickly escorted him out. Jacob turned to Catherine, his voice low but resolute. "He'll come back, but we'll fight him, together." And for the first time, Catherine truly believed it. The winter months stretched on like an unending test of patience, with each passing day blending into the next. The silence of the ranch, punctuated only by the howling wind and the occasional creak of the cabin as it settled against the cold. For Jacob and Catherine, the days were a constant mixture of routine and anticipation. The wedding, though interrupted by Richard's threat, had brought them closer, but the danger was far from over. Richard Brennan had made it clear he would return, and the looming threat of a legal battle hung over them like a storm cloud. Despite this, Jacob threw himself into the work of the ranch, chopping firewood, mending fences, and tending to the livestock, all the while keeping a watchful eye on the horizon, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Catherine, on the other hand, had found a rhythm in her new life. She spent her days cooking, cleaning, and caring for Lena, whose giggles and small steps brought light to the otherwise grim days. Lena had grown stronger since their arrival, now able to crawl and explore, a reminder of the life that was slowly growing around them. Catherine also spent her time sewing clothes for her new family and organizing the small house. The solitude of the ranch felt both comforting and isolating. They were alone together in a way that could never be undone. The months of January and February passed in a blur, with every day filled with small moments of connection. Jacob teaching her how to shoot a rifle, Lena learning to say her first words, the three of them sitting by the fire as Jacob read aloud from the books Catherine had brought with her. Each moment, while small, was a building block, a way of constructing the family they had both longed for but never thought would come. Still, the anxiety never fully left Catherine's chest. She knew that the court date loomed large, a day when their lives would be determined by forces beyond their control. But Jacob never spoke of it directly, always redirecting the conversation to the here and now. "We'll make it," he would say, but Catherine could hear the quiet worry beneath his words. She had never seen him so determined, but she also saw the cracks in his facade, the weight of a life he wasn't prepared for, but was stepping into nonetheless. One of the most difficult parts of their marriage was the unspoken truth that they were both struggling to understand what it meant to be a family. Jacob was still learning how to father Lena, still finding his way with her, as though unsure how deep his love for her could run. He hadn't said much about it, but Catherine could feel his distance at times. It wasn't that he was cold. Jacob had proven himself kind in small ways, teaching Lena how to walk, carefully lifting her when she cried, and even carving wooden toys for her in the evenings when the fire was low. But there were moments of hesitation, a certain uncertainty in the way he held her or spoke to her. Catherine understood it was not an easy thing to be thrust into fatherhood unexpectedly. It was a burden no man should have to bear alone. And yet here they were, both carrying the weight of the world. The arrival of February brought with it a reminder of how precarious their situation was. The letter came the middle of the month, delivered by a rider on horseback. Jacob read it first, his face growing darker as he passed it to Catherine. It was a legal notice filed by Richard Brennan, challenging their claim to Lena and demanding custody of her, claiming that Catherine was an unfit mother and that Jacob had no legal standing to adopt her. The letter set the court date for March 15th, and with it came a sense of finality. This was not a fight they could escape. It was a battle they would have to face head on. The news hit Catherine hard, her heart sinking as she read the words. She had never been to court before, had never had a fight for anything in her life, but now everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for was on the line. Lena was her world, and the thought of losing her was too much to bear. Jacob, too, was affected. The ranch had barely made it through the winter, and now, with the legal costs piling up, they were facing the possibility of losing everything. "We'll sell the south pasture," Jacob said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet determination. Catherine's heart dropped. The land was all they had. It was the future Jacob had hoped for, the future he had worked his whole life to build. Selling it was not an easy decision. "That's your future," Catherine protested, her voice trembling. Jacob turned to her, his eyes filled with a softness that surprised her. "You're my future. Her. This family. Land means nothing if I lose you," he said, his words cutting through her fear. She didn't know how to respond to that. She had never known a man willing to sacrifice so much for her, for them. Jacob had come into this marriage with as much fear as she had, yet he was stepping forward, making choices that would affect their future. It was humbling, and it was terrifying. As the weeks went on, the pressure only seemed to build. Catherine found herself waking in the middle of the night, her mind racing with the thought of Lena being taken from her. She had never had much in life. No wealth, no family, no home. But now she had something precious, something worth fighting for. The thought of losing it was unbearable. Jacob, too, was haunted by the looming court case. He didn't speak of it much, but Catherine could see it in his eyes. The way he furrowed his brow when he looked out the window, the way his shoulders sagged when he thought no one was looking. He was afraid that he wasn't enough to protect them, that the love they had built wouldn't be enough to keep their family together. One evening, after a long day of work, Jacob sat beside Catherine by the fire, the warmth of the flames casting a soft glow on their faces. Catherine noticed the change in him, the way he seemed less guarded, more vulnerable. "I'm scared," Jacob admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared I'm not enough." Catherine took his hand, her fingers brushing against his rough palm. "You are," she said, her voice steady. "You've been more than enough. You've been everything." Jacob's eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real, and it meant the world to Catherine. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the fire crackling between them, and for the first time since they had arrived, Catherine felt like they were in this together. Not just for Lena, but for themselves. The days leading up to the trial were a blur. Jacob and Catherine gathered evidence for the case. Witness statements from Mrs. Halloway, the sheriff, and the preacher, all of whom had seen the way Jacob and Catherine had taken care of Lena. They worked tirelessly to gather what they needed, though Catherine was still haunted by the thought that it wouldn't be enough. Richard Brennan had money, influence, and a powerful legal team. What did they have? They had each other, and that, at least, had to count for something. But even with the support of their neighbors, the odds didn't feel like they were in their favor. On the night before the trial, Catherine found Jacob kneeling in the barn, his hands clasped together in silent prayer. The sight of him, usually so strong and sure, brought tears to her eyes. She stepped forward and knelt beside him, her hands resting on his. "What are you praying for?" she asked softly. Jacob looked up at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I don't talk to God much, but I'm asking now. I'm asking for our family." Catherine nodded, her heart swelling. She had never been a woman of much faith, but in that moment, she understood. This fight wasn't just for Lena. It was for their future, for the family they had fought so hard to build. "I'll pray too," she said quietly. Together, they held their hands in silence, praying for the strength to face the coming storm. The next day, they packed their wagon, Lena asleep in her blanket, and set off for the county courthouse. It would be a 2-day ride through the harsh winter cold, and neither of them knew what the outcome would be. But they knew one thing for sure. They would face it together. Jacob turned to Catherine as they left the ranch, his voice calm but resolute. "Whatever happens," he said, "we face it together." And with that, they disappeared into the snow, heading toward their uncertain future. The courthouse in the county seat was a far cry from the small, humble church where Jacob and Catherine had married. Towering stone walls, cold and intimidating, made the building feel like a fortress rather than a place of justice. It stood on the edge of a bustling town, and as Jacob and Catherine walked through the heavy wooden doors, they were immediately confronted by a sense of overwhelming formality. The courthouse was crowded with townspeople, many of whom had made the journey to witness the trial. Some had come out of curiosity, others to show support, but the weight of judgment was palpable, especially in the eyes of the few who still sided with Richard Brennan. Jacob's hand was steady on Catherine's back as they walked toward the front, but his gaze remained focused, a look of quiet determination on his face. He had spent months preparing for this moment, for the fight that would determine the fate of their family. The town, for all its isolation, had a way of gossiping, and Jacob had heard the whispers, some of them questioning his ability to be a father, others wondering why he had taken on a woman and a child who weren't his own. But he had made his choice. He had chosen Catherine and Lena, and he wasn't backing down. As they entered the courtroom, Richard Brennan was already seated, his posture straight, a smirk playing at the edges of his lips. The contrast between him and Jacob was striking. Richard wore a fine suit, his coat tailored and crisp, his hair neatly combed, exuding the confidence that came from wealth and privilege. Jacob, on the other hand, looked like a man who had spent his life working the land, his rough hands and callous palms showing the signs of a hard life well lived. Richard was not alone. He had brought with him a team of expensive Eastern lawyers, men who spoke in smooth, polished tones, men whose job it was to twist the law in their favor. Jacob, by contrast, had a local lawyer, a kind, soft-spoken man who did his best but was clearly outmatched. The judge, an elderly man with a stern demeanor, sat at the bench, his gavel resting in front of him. The room fell silent as he banged it, signaling the start of the trial. "This is a matter of custody, and we are here to determine who has the legal right to care for Miss Lena Brennan," the judge intoned. "Mr. Brennan, you may begin." Richard's lawyer rose to his feet, his voice smooth and confident as he began to lay out the case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court, we are here because Miss Lena Brennan, a child of fine breeding and considerable wealth, deserves to be raised by her own flesh and blood. Catherine Miller, her mother, is a woman of dubious morals, and her relationship with Mr. Jacob Miller is, at best, an unfortunate mistake. Mr. Miller, though undoubtedly a man of hard work, is not a father, and he has no legal standing to claim this child as his own." The words stung, and Catherine felt her chest tighten with each sentence. She could hear the subtle condemnation in the lawyer's voice, and it made her feel small, exposed. She had never wanted to be a burden to anyone, let alone to a man like Jacob, and now she was being painted as unfit to care for her own child. The lawyer continued, painting a picture of Catherine as a deceitful woman who had trapped Jacob in a marriage, while her motives were questioned at every turn. He called witnesses, some of whom had never seen her with Lena, others who had only heard rumors about her past. Catherine was called to the stand, and as she walked to the witness chair, her legs felt like they might give out beneath her. She knew what was coming. She had been prepared for the worst, but standing in front of the judge, under the harsh gaze of Richard's lawyer, she couldn't help but feel the weight of every word, every question, as if they were arrows aimed directly at her heart. "Did you deceive Mr. Miller about the child?" the lawyer asked sharply. Catherine took a deep breath, her hands trembling in her lap. "Yes," she admitted quietly. I did not tell him about Lena when we first corresponded. The courtroom murmured, and Catherine felt her face flush with shame. And why is that? The lawyer pressed, leaning forward. Because I was afraid, Catherine said softly, her voice breaking. I was afraid that he would not want us, me or my child. I had nowhere else to go. I didn't know what else to do. There was a long silence. The lawyer didn't let up. And now you ask this court to grant you custody of a child who isn't even your husband's. You claim that Mr. Miller is fit to raise this child. But what proof do you have of that? Catherine swallowed hard, her mind racing. She thought of Jacob, of how hard he had worked to provide for her, to care for Lena. He had never once hesitated, never once shown anything but kindness, despite the turmoil of their situation. But her voice faltered as she struggled to find the right words. Jacob loves Lena. He has shown her nothing but love since the moment he met her. He may not be her father by blood, but he's her father in every other way. There was a pause, and the lawyer scoffed. How can you claim that? How can you claim that a man who has known her for barely 2 months could love her? Catherine's heart sank as the lawyer continued, pushing her further into a corner. The questions became sharper, more personal, aimed at her character, at her decisions, at the choices she had made. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her, the judgment hanging in the air like a thick fog. But it was when Richard Brennan took the stand that everything changed. His smirk was gone, replaced by a calm, calculated demeanor. He spoke of his wealth, his family's legacy, and his concern for his niece. He portrayed himself as a man simply looking out for the child's future, a future that he claimed could only be secured by bringing her back into the Brennan fold. His words were measured, filled with legal jargon, but Catherine saw through them. This wasn't about Lena's well-being. It was about money, about control. Catherine felt a surge of anger as she listened to him, but she kept her composure. He didn't care about Lena. He only cared about what she could bring him. Jacob was called to the stand next, and as he stepped up, Catherine felt her heart race. He was calm, collected, but his eyes were dark with the weight of what he was about to face. You married Catherine Miller, correct? Richard's lawyer asked, his voice dripping with disdain. Yes, Jacob replied, his voice steady. And you've taken responsibility for her child, Miss Lena? Yes, Jacob said again, his gaze unwavering. She's my daughter. I've been her father since the moment I decided to marry Catherine. The lawyer pressed further. And do you truly believe you're capable of raising this child? Jacob's jaw tightened, and for the first time, his voice cracked. I don't need to be her biological father to love her. I've been there for her every step of the way, and I'll continue to be there. She's mine. The courtroom fell silent. Jacob's words hung in the air, raw and powerful. There was no argument against it. He had shown up. He had been there when it mattered. And in that moment, it didn't matter what blood ran through Lena's veins. Jacob had been the one to care for her, to protect her. As the trial drew to a close, both sides had made their cases. Richard's lawyer was confident, his argument strong on paper, but Jacob's sincerity had resonated with the court. As the judge called for a recess, the tension in the room was palpable. Catherine's heart hammered in her chest, her future uncertain. She looked at Jacob, his hand resting on hers, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of what they were fighting for. Their family was at stake, and they wouldn't back down. The judge had called for the deliberation to continue the next day. Catherine could only pray that their love, their commitment, would be enough to win. The morning of March 16th, 1885, came too quickly, the anxiety heavy in the air as Jacob, Catherine, and their small group gathered in the courthouse, a final few steps between them and the judgment that would shape their future. Catherine sat beside Jacob, her hands gripping the edge of the bench as she tried to steady her breathing. Lena sitting in her lap, playing quietly with a small wooden toy Jacob had carved for her. The courthouse was packed, much larger than the small town of their ranch, the walls feeling as if they were closing in on them. The judge, a man known for his no-nonsense approach, had called the court to order, and now they were waiting for his verdict. Richard Brennan sat across the room, his expression unreadable, his lawyers whispering among themselves. It was clear that they still believed they had the upper hand. The trial had been grueling, but Jacob had spoken from his heart, his words ringing true in that room. His testimony about the love he had for Lena, about the life he had built for her and Catherine, had shifted the momentum, but Catherine knew the decision wasn't made yet. The judge had deliberated long into the night, and now they were about to find out whether all their efforts, all their sacrifices, would amount to anything. Catherine could feel the weight of the past months pressing down on her, the long nights of worry, the uncertainty of whether they would have a future together. She had come so far from the scared woman who had arrived at Jacob's ranch, with nothing but a child and a dream of safety. Now, her world seemed to hang in the balance, each second stretching into an eternity. The judge finally rose, his gavel in hand, his face serious as he addressed the court. "This case has troubled me deeply," he began, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the decision. "On one hand, we have blood law. Mr. Brennan is the child's uncle, a man with legal standing." Catherine's heart sank as the words echoed in her mind. Blood law, something that had haunted her since the day she gave birth to Lena. Richard Brennan, a man who had abandoned them, now had a claim to her daughter simply because of blood. Catherine felt a deep knot in her stomach. But on the other hand, the judge continued, "We have the law of the heart. Mr. and Mrs. Miller have demonstrated consistent care, love, and commitment to this child. They have proven themselves to be the parents that Lena needs." The words that followed felt like a blessing, but Catherine couldn't fully process them until they were fully spoken. "Mr. Brennan, you have legal standing as Lena's blood relative, but you abandoned this child and her mother when they were most vulnerable. You turned them out in winter, pregnant and destitute. You only returned when money became involved." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected the judge to speak so openly about Richard's cruelty. It was as though a weight had been lifted from her chest. The law recognizes blood, but it also recognizes abandonment. The judge continued, "Mr. and Mrs. Miller have demonstrated consistent care, love, and commitment to this child. They have proven themselves to be the parents that Lena needs." The words that followed felt like a blessing, but Catherine couldn't fully process them until they were fully spoken. "Mr. Brennan, you have legal standing as Lena's blood relative, but you abandoned this child and her mother when they were most vulnerable. You turned them out in winter, pregnant and destitute. You only returned when money became involved." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected the judge to speak so openly about Richard's cruelty. It was as though a weight had been lifted from her chest. The law recognizes blood, but it also recognizes abandonment. The judge continued, "Mr. and Mrs. Miller have stepped in when no one else would. The child is healthy, thriving, clearly bonded to them. Mrs. Miller is the biological mother, and her rights are paramount." Catherine held her breath as the judge turned to Jacob and her. "Mr. Miller has legally adopted Lena through marriage, and I find that the Miller family has shown nothing but care and devotion." Catherine's heart soared as she realized what the judge was saying. "Custody of Lena remains with Mr. and Mrs. Miller," he announced. "Mr. Brennan's petition is denied." The words hung in the air, each syllable a lifeline, pulling them from the storm of uncertainty and into a future that was finally theirs. The courtroom erupted in both cheers and protests, the room filled with noise as people reacted to the decision. Catherine's hands shook as she turned to Jacob, her eyes filled with disbelief and joy. Jacob squeezed her hand, a tear slipping down his cheek as he looked at her, his face soft with relief and emotion. "We did it," he whispered. Catherine nodded, her throat tight with gratitude. They had done it, together. Richard Brennan stood, his face dark with fury. "This isn't over," he spat, storming out of the courtroom, his lawyers following closely behind. But the judge's voice rang out, cutting through the tension. "You may appeal, Mr. Brennan," he said coldly, "but I doubt you'll win. Good day." Richard did not respond, his fury evident as he stormed out of the courtroom, but Catherine felt the weight of the threat lift from her shoulders. The man who had tried to take her daughter away, who had seen her as nothing more than a piece of property, was defeated. Jacob's arm wrapped around her, pulling her close as they both breathed a sigh of relief. The trial was over. Lena was theirs. As the court session ended, they made their way out of the courthouse, their hearts light and their spirits high. The cold air hit them as they stepped outside, but it didn't matter. The world felt different now. The weight of uncertainty replaced with a warmth of certainty. They had won, and nothing could take away the family they had built. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the journey long, but each mile felt like a victory. The snow had stopped falling, and the sun peeked out from behind the clouds, casting a soft golden light over the landscape. Lena giggled in the back of the wagon, playing with a small doll, her laughter filling the air. Catherine smiled at Jacob, her heart full. "I can't believe it's over," she said, her voice soft. Jacob nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "It's not over," he replied, his voice filled with certainty. "It's just beginning." As they approached the ranch, they could see the land stretching out before them, a place they had fought for, a place where they could finally be free. The ranch had been their home for months, but it felt different now. It was no longer just a house or a plot of land. It was a symbol of their family, of their resilience. They had been through so much, but now they had something worth fighting for. As they pulled up to the house, the neighbors were waiting for them. Mrs. Halloway, the sheriff, the preacher, and others were there to greet them, their faces full of joy and support. The community had come together, their acceptance final. Jacob helped Catherine down from the wagon, and together they walked into their home, the doors wide open, welcoming them. The future was theirs. The next few months passed quickly, the seasons changing as they settled into their new life. Spring brought with it a new sense of hope. The garden was planted. Lena took her first steps, and Catherine's belly began to grow as she carried their second child. The ranch flourished, and so did their family. Jacob built an addition to the house, a small nursery for the new baby, and each night they sat together by the fire, reading books and talking about the future. In the quiet moments, when the world outside seemed far away, they were content. They had each other, and that was enough. Christmas Eve of 1885 arrived, marking 1 year since Catherine had stepped off the train with Lena in her arms. The house was decorated with homemade ornaments, the fire crackling in the hearth. Lena, now almost 2, toddled around with a doll Jacob had carved for her, laughing as she showed it off to everyone. The community had gathered once again, celebrating with a feast, music, and dancing. After the guests left, Jacob and Catherine sat together in front of the fire, Lena asleep between them. Jacob looked at his family, his heart full. 1 year ago, he said softly, "I stood on that platform, unsure if I'd accept you. I was terrified, angry even. But now," he paused, his voice filled with emotion, "I can't imagine life without you. Either of you." Catherine smiled, her hand resting on his. "We were both desperate. Both needed saving." She looked at Lena, her heart swelling. "You saved us, but we saved you too." Lena stirred in her sleep, and Jacob leaned down, kissing her forehead. "I love you both," he whispered, "more than I ever thought I could." The room fell quiet, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to vanish. It was just the 3 of them together. As Catherine's labor began, she looked at Jacob with a smile. "The baby's coming," she said softly, her voice filled with joy. "On Christmas." Jacob kissed her forehead, his eyes filled with love. "Our family is complete," he whispered. "We've got everything we need." The snow began to fall again, soft and gentle, as the sounds of a new life echoed through the ranch. And for the first time, everything felt right.